It was a night of torrential rain in downtown Boston, a night that mirrored the storm of judgment brewing inside the city's most exclusive restaurant, Aurelia. The players were set a world-class chef patrons, dripping in diamonds, and a manager whose smile was as sharp as his designer suit. Then the doors opened, and an old man in a threadbare coat walked in, shattering the illusion of perfection. They saw a beggar, a problem, a mistake. They were ready to throw him out into the storm. But they missed the truth, hidden in plain sight, a truth only one person could understand. This isn't just a story about a misunderstanding. It's about a secret, buried for 30 years, a desperate search for a lost soul, and how the quietest voice in the room became the only one that mattered. The chandeliers of Aurelia dripped light like liquid diamonds, casting a warm, golden glow over the hushed conversations and the delicate clinking of silver on porcelain. Every surface, from the polished marble floors to the deep mahogany bar, gleamed with the quiet confidence of old money. This was a sanctuary for Boston's elite, a place where a reservation was a status symbol, and the price of an entree could cover a month's rent for most people. Julian Croft, the restaurant's manager, surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a king. Dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford suit, his posture was impeccable, his eyes scanning for any imperfection, a crooked fork, a wilting flower, a guest whose attire didn't meet the unspoken but rigorously enforced standard. Outside, the heavens had opened up. A furious autumn storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the wind howling a mournful song that was thankfully muted by the thick, soundproof glass. It was on a particularly violent gust of wind that the heavy oak doors swung open, bringing with them a swirl of rain-soaked leaves and two figures that seemed entirely out of place. The first was a younger man, perhaps in his late 30s, his black suit soaked through and clinging to his frame. His face was a mask of anxiety, his eyes wide as he took in the opulent surroundings. But it was the man he was escorting who drew every eye in the room. He was elderly, likely in his late 70s, with a face etched with the kind of deep lines that speak of a long and difficult life. He wore a simple dark grey coat, not of fine wool, but of a worn, almost threadbare material. His shoes were practical but scuffed, and his silver hair was matted to his forehead by the rain. He clutched a small, cloth-wrapped bundle to his chest, his knuckles white. Julian's smile tightened into a bloodless line. This was the imperfection he was paid to prevent. He glided towards the entrance, his movements smooth and predatory. The couple at the table nearest the door, the well-known socialites Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, visibly recoiled. Mrs. Davenport subtly covered her nose with a silk napkin, as if the mere presence of poverty carried a foul odor. "Good evening," Julian said, his voice, a low, chillingly polite baritone. The words were a greeting, but the tone was a dismissal. "May I help you?" The younger man, flustered, bowed slightly. "Reservation?" "Yes. For two. The name is Kim." His English was heavily accented, broken and stilted. Julian's eyes flickered to his tablet. He pretended to scroll, though he knew perfectly well there was no reservation under that name. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't seem to have a Kim on my list for this evening. We are fully booked, as you can see." He gestured vaguely at the half-empty dining room. It was a lie, but a necessary one to maintain the restaurant's caliber. No. Please, the younger man, Mr. Kim, pleaded, his desperation growing. He pointed to the old man who stood silently, his gaze drifting around the room, not with awe, but with a strange, searching intensity. "He is very important. We must come in." From her station near the kitchen, a young waitress named Leora Kennedy watched the scene unfold. Leora was practically invisible in a place like Aurelia. With her plain brown hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and a uniform designed to make her blend into the background, she was just another cog in the well-oiled machine. But unlike the others, she wasn't looking at the old man's clothes. She was looking at his eyes. They were filled with a profound sadness, a deep, weary sorrow that seemed to swallow the glittering lights of the restaurant whole. It was a look she recognized, a look she sometimes saw in her own reflection. Her co-worker Chloe sidled up to her, a tray of empty champagne flutes balanced on her hip. "Look at that," she whispered, her voice laced with disdain. "Julian's going to have a fit. I can't believe they let someone like that walk in off the street. They probably just want to use the bathroom." Leora didn't respond. She felt a strange pang of defensiveness for the old man. There was a quiet dignity about him, a stillness that contrasted sharply with his companion's frantic energy and Julian's cold hostility. The old man said nothing, but his lips moved silently, forming words no one could hear. Julian's patience, already a shallow resource, was evaporating. "Sir, I must ask you to leave. You are disturbing our guests." His voice had lost its polite veneer, replaced by a steely command. He took a step closer, placing a hand on the younger man's arm. Mr. Kim flinched. "Please, just 5 minutes. We will pay. Cash. A lot." He fumbled inside his jacket, but Julian held up a hand, stopping him. "This is not about money," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is about maintaining a certain atmosphere, an ambiance. And with all due respect, you and your associate do not fit." The old man finally seemed to register the confrontation. He looked at Julian, then at Mr. Kim, and then his eyes scanned the room again, landing for a moment on the kitchen door. He spoke for the first time. His voice was raspy, weak, and the language he used was not English. It was Korean. A ripple of confusion and annoyance went through the nearby tables. Mrs. Davenport scoffed audibly. "What on earth is he saying, Julian? Handle this." Julian's face hardened. This was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a scene. "I don't know what you're saying, and I don't care. The answer is no. Now, if you don't leave immediately, I will be forced to call security." The old man's face, already etched with sorrow, crumpled further. He looked utterly lost, a man adrift in a sea of hostility and misunderstanding. He clutched his small bundle tighter and repeated the same phrase in Korean, his voice now pleading, desperate. Across the room, Leora's heart stopped. She knew that language. It was a ghost language from a life she barely remembered, a language she had spoken as a small child in a faraway land before being adopted by an American family. She understood every word he said, and what he was saying was not a demand or a threat. It was a question, a desperate, heart-wrenching question. Is this the place he was asking his companion, his voice trembling? Is this truly the place where she was last seen? The tension at the entrance of Aurelia had thickened to a suffocating degree. Julian Croft stood arms crossed, a human barricade of tailored fabric and icy disdain. Mr. Kim was gesturing wildly, his limited English failing him completely as he tried to convey the gravity of their purpose. The elderly Korean man, Mr. Han, had fallen silent again, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the hopeful light that had briefly flickered in his eyes now extinguished. To the patrons of Aurelia, the matter was settled. 2 vagrants had wandered in from the storm and were being justly ejected. Chloe nudged Leora again. "God, this is so awkward. Julian should just call the cops already. They're holding up the whole flow of the evening." But Leora wasn't listening. Her mind was racing a whirlwind of fragmented memories, and a language she hadn't spoken fluently in over 20 years. The old man's words echoed in her head. Is this truly the place where she was last seen? It wasn't the question of a man looking for a meal. It was the question of a pilgrim at the end of a long and painful journey. She felt an almost physical pull towards them, an instinct she couldn't explain. Her parents, the Kennedys, had been loving and kind, but they had encouraged her to assimilate, to become fully American. They'd seen her Korean heritage as a chapter that was closed, a past to be moved on from. So she had. She had let the language fade, buried the vague, dreamlike images of her infancy under layers of English and American culture. Yet here it was, bubbling to the surface, raw and insistent, awakened by the sorrow in a stranger's voice. "So this is your final warning," Julian's voice boomed, startling her back to the present. He had his phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the number for building security. Mr. Kim looked panicked. He turned to Mr. Han and spoke rapidly in Korean, his voice full of apology and frustration. "I'm sorry, Chairman. They won't listen. They don't understand. We should go." The word chairman struck Leora. Huejang-nim. It was a title of utmost respect, reserved for the head of a major corporation. A chairman, this frail, poorly dressed old man, it didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. Chloe's assessment of them as beggars was clearly wrong, but the truth was obscured by a wall of prejudice and miscommunication. It was the look on Mr. Han's face that finally broke through Leora's hesitation. It was a look of utter desolation, the look of a man who had travelled thousands of miles only to be turned away at the final door. His gaze swept the restaurant one last time, filled with a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight in the room. He gave a small, defeated nod to Mr. Kim, ready to surrender and return to the stormy night. Something inside Leora snapped. It was a rebellion against Julian's smug cruelty, against the snickering patrons, against her own lifetime of quiet compliance. She put her water pitcher down on a nearby service stand with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Don't, Chloe," hissed, grabbing her arm. "Leora, what are you doing? You'll get fired." Leora gently pulled her arm free. Maybe she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But I can't just stand here." She walked forward, her sensible black shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. Every eye in the restaurant turned to her. Julian shot her a look of pure fury, a silent command to return to her station. The Davenports looked at her with bewildered contempt, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly decided to move on its own. Leora ignored them all. Her focus was solely on the two men at the door. She stopped a few feet from them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, to keep them from shaking. She took a deep breath, dredging up the formal cadences of a language she had only ever spoken as a toddler. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect that was as foreign to this environment as the men themselves. And then she spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the heavy silence. She addressed the old man directly. She bowed slightly and spoke softly in Korean. "Excuse me, sir. Is there something I can help you with?" The effect was instantaneous and seismic. The entire restaurant fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The low murmur of conversation ceased. The clinking of cutlery stopped mid-air. Mr. Kim's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with disbelief. Julian Croft froze his face, a comical mask of shock and outrage. Chloe, back by the service station, looked as if Leora had just sprouted a second head. But the most profound reaction came from Mr. Han. His head, which had been bowed in defeat, shot up. His weary, clouded eyes cleared, focusing on Leora with an electrifying intensity. For a long moment, he just stared at her, as if she were an apparition. He took a half-step forward, his lips parting in astonishment. He had been adrift in a hostile alien ocean, and suddenly someone had thrown him a lifeline. Someone understood. The old man gasped, replying in Korean, You speak my language." Leora nodded, a small, reassuring smile gracing her lips for the first time. "Yes, a little. How may I assist you?" The exchange, lasting only a few seconds, had completely upended the power dynamic in the room. Julian, who had been in total control, was now a confused outsider, listening to a conversation he couldn't comprehend. The waitress he saw as a disposable employee had just become the most important person in the room. He lowered his phone, his expression shifting from anger to utter bewilderment. Mr. Han's gaze didn't leave Leora's face. He seemed to be searching for something in her features. He spoke again, this time to Mr. Kim, but his eyes remained locked on Leora. Kim Biseo. Secretary Kim explained to this young lady. Mr. Kim, recovering from his shock, bowed deeply to Leora. My apologies, miss. We did not mean to cause trouble. My chairman, he is not here for dinner. He switched back to Korean, speaking to Leora, directly relief pouring out of him in a torrent of words. We have traveled from Seoul. The chairman John Han is looking for a place that used to be here many years ago, an orphanage, St. Jude's Home for Children. Leora's breath caught in her throat. John Han. The name sounded vaguely familiar, like a name she might have read in the business section of a newspaper. Chairman of what? And St. Jude's. She knew that name. Before Aurelia was built, the land had indeed housed an old city orphanage torn down decades ago. She translated for the still flummoxed Julian. Sir, his name is John Han. He's not here to eat. He says he's looking for St. Jude's orphanage, which used to be on this property. Julian blinked, processing the information. An orphanage that was demolished 30 years ago. What business does he have with a ghost? His tone was still dismissive, but the certainty had gone out of it. He was off balance. Leora ignored him, turning her full attention back to Mr. Han. She asked him in Korean, honored elder, "Why are you searching for an orphanage that no longer exists, mister?" Han's eyes misted over. He clutched the cloth bundle to his chest as if it were a precious treasure. When he spoke, his voice was thick with a grief that spanned decades. He whispered in Korean, "I'm looking for my lost daughter." The 3 words spoken in the quiet, grief-stricken Korean of the old man landed in the opulent dining room with the force of a physical blow. My lost daughter. Leora felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't about a business deal gone wrong or a confused tourist. This was a pilgrimage of the heart. The entire narrative that Julian and the other patrons had constructed of vagrancy of unworthiness crumbled into dust. She looked from Mr. Han's anguished face to Julian's stunned one, and realized she was now the bridge between 2 completely different worlds. She turned to Julian, her voice steady and firm. No longer the timid waitress, but a confident interpreter. Mr. Croft, Chairman Han, is not looking for a building. He is looking for his daughter. He believes this was the last place he ever saw her. Julian's mouth opened and closed silently. The name Chairman Han, combined with the heart-wrenching revelation, had completely disarmed him. The Davenports were now leaning forward in their seats, their earlier disdain replaced by a rapt, almost ghoulish curiosity. The story was far more interesting than their overpriced lobster thermidor. Mr. Han, seeing the change in the atmosphere and sensing that Leora was his only ally, took a tentative step into the restaurant. No one stopped him this time. He looked directly at Leora, his eyes pleading with her to listen to understand. Mr. Kim stayed by his side, a silent, supportive presence. Ask him to elaborate. Julian managed to say his voice, a hoarse whisper. The authority had bled out of him, leaving behind a pale, confused man in an expensive suit. Leora didn't need to be told. She knelt slightly, a subconscious gesture to bring herself closer to Mr. Han's level to show respect and encourage him to speak. Elder, if you are comfortable, would you tell me the story of your daughter? Mr. Han nodded slowly, his gaze turning inward as if watching a film from the distant past. He began to speak, his Korean, soft and melodic, tinged with an enduring sorrow. Leora listened, her entire being focused on his words, translating not just the language, but the deep well of emotion behind it. It was just after the war. Leora translated her voice soft, but clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. He was young and a widower. His wife had passed away during childbirth. He was desperately poor, working day and night, just to survive with no family to help him. Mr. Han paused, swallowing hard. He gestured with his free hand, painting a picture of a bleak, post-war Korea, filled with poverty and despair. He had a daughter, Leora continued, her own voice, catching slightly. A beautiful baby girl named Mi-young. She was his entire world, the only light in his life. But he fell gravely ill. He had no way to care for her. He feared she would starve. The hardest decision he ever had to make was to take her to an international adoption agency, which worked with orphanages here in America. He brought her to St. Jude's. A collective soft gasp went through the room. The story was becoming deeply personal, deeply human. This wasn't just a rich man's whim. It was the raw pain of a father. He promised her he would come back. Leora's translation was barely a whisper now. He told the staff at the orphanage that it was temporary. He just needed to get back on his feet. He sold the only thing of value he had, his late wife's wedding ring, to pay for her initial care. He swore he would return for her within a year. Mr. Han's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He looked around Aurelia, at the gold leaf on the ceiling and the plush velvet chairs. But he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing the cold, sterile walls of an orphanage from 30 years ago. But fate was cruel. Leora said, her voice trembling with the weight of his story. A month after he left her, there was a fire. A terrible administrative fire at the agency's main office. All the records were destroyed. When he finally recovered his health and scraped together enough money to come to America, there was no trace of her. The orphanage had a new director. They had no record of a Han Mi-young, whose father was supposed to return. They assumed she was a true orphan. She had already been adopted by an American family. They couldn't or wouldn't tell him who they were or where they had gone. The silence in the restaurant was now one of profound, shared empathy. The clatter and conversation had been replaced by a sacred stillness. This old man, who they had judged so harshly, had spent the last 3 decades living with a wound that would not heal. Mr. Orr. Kim stepped forward and spoke to Leora in quiet Korean. She nodded and turned back to the room. His companion, Mr. Kim, says that Chairman Han never gave up. As he built his business, from nothing becoming one of South Korea's most successful entrepreneurs, every spare resource went into the search. He hired dozens of private investigators over the years. They followed countless dead ends. But he never forgot the name of this place, St. Jude's, on this very street. The story was almost too tragic to be real, yet the raw, undeniable grief on Mr. Han's face was proof of its truth. He had finally amassed a fortune, the kind of wealth that could buy anything in the world, but it was all meaningless, because he couldn't buy back the one thing he had lost. Then Mr. Han did something that captivated everyone. With trembling fingers, he began to unwrap the small cloth bundle he had been clutching so tightly. Inside was not money or anything of obvious value. It was a small, worn, child-sized silver locket, tarnished with age, and a single faded photograph. He held the photograph out for Leora to see. It was a picture of a smiling young man holding a baby wrapped in a thick blanket. The baby was tiny, but her eyes were bright, and her face was a perfect tiny copy of the old man's. Mi-young, he whispered in Korean, his thumb caressing the faded image. He then spoke directly to Leora, his voice full of a new urgency. He has one last hope, she translated, her eyes wide. Before he left her, he noticed she had a unique birthmark, a tiny crescent-shaped mole right here. He pointed to the spot just behind his own right ear. He asks if, by some miracle, anyone who worked here, or any of the old staff, might remember a Korean baby with a mark like that. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate last-ditch effort. He had come all this way, not for a confrontation, but for a fragment of a memory, a sliver of a chance. Julian Croft, who had been standing silent and pale, finally moved. He walked over to a discreetly placed telephone. I know the owner of this property group, he stammered. His father was the one who bought this land from the city. Maybe they have some of the old archival records from the demolition. I can call him. It was a small gesture, but for Julian, it was a monumental act of contrition. He was trying to fix what his prejudice had almost broken. But Leora was no longer listening to Julian. She was staring at Mr. Hun, a strange, dizzying feeling washing over her. A crescent-shaped birthmark, behind the right ear. Her hand, as if with a mind of its own, slowly rose. Her fingers trembled as she brushed her hair back from behind her own right ear. Her heart was pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. She had always had it. A tiny, dark, crescent-shaped mole, a unique little mark she'd sometimes traced absent-mindedly. Her adoptive parents had called it her little moon. The room, the people, the lights, they all faded away into a muffled roar. There was only the old man's hopeful, searching face, and the impossible, earth-shattering thought that was blooming in her mind. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an elastic, silent moment. Leora's fingers rested on the small, raised mark behind her ear, a familiar piece of her own geography that had suddenly become foreign and monumental. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. The low hum of the restaurant, the distant sound of Julian's hushed, urgent voice on the phone, the storm still raging outside, it all receded into a distant buzz. A tiny, crescent-shaped mole. Mr. Han's eyes, which had been scanning the room with a desperate, unfocused hope, finally settled on Leora. He saw her hand go to her ear. He saw the look of dawning, terrified wonder on her face. A flicker of impossible hope ignited in his gaze. He took a faltering step closer, his breath catching in his throat. "Young lady," he whispered, the question hanging in the air, laden with the weight of 30 years of searching. Leora couldn't speak. Her mind was a chaotic storm of images and feelings. Her childhood, her loving but distinctly non-Korean parents in Vermont, the persistent low-grade feeling of being slightly out of place, the questions about her origins that she had learned to suppress because they had no answers. Her name was Leora Kennedy. She was an American. She was a waitress, struggling to pay off student loans for a degree in art history she wasn't even using. But before she was Leora Kennedy, was she, my young Mr. Kim saw the exchange, the silent, powerful current passing between his chairman and the waitress. He looked from Mr. Han's trembling hope to Leora's pale, shocked face, and his own eyes widened in stunning realization. Could it be, after all the dead ends, all the false leads, all the crushing disappointments? Could the search have ended here in the most improbable way, imaginable on a rainy Tuesday night in a Boston restaurant? Chairman Mr. Kim breathed in Korean, placing a steadying hand on Mr. Han's arm. "So what is it?" But Mr. Han didn't seem to hear him. He was locked onto Leora. He spoke again, his voice cracking with an emotion so powerful it was painful to witness. This time it wasn't a question. It was a memory. He said in Korean, "Your mother used to call you Little Moon." Little Moon. The exact nickname her adoptive parents had given her for the birthmark. A coincidence? It had to be a coincidence. The world couldn't possibly be this small, this poetically cruel and beautiful all at once. Leora's legs felt weak. She swayed slightly, and Chloe, who had crept closer, rushed to her side. "Leora, are you okay?" "You're white as a sheet." Leora barely registered her friend's presence. She looked at Mr. Han, and for the first time, she wasn't just seeing a sad old man. She was searching his face, looking for a ghost of a reflection of her own. The shape of his eyes, the high cheekbones, the way his mouth turned down slightly at the corners when he was worried. Were those familiar because they were his, or because they were hers? From across the room, Julian hung up the phone, his face ashen. He walked back towards the group looking utterly defeated. The owner said most of the St. Jude's archives were lost to water damage years ago. "There's nothing. I'm so sorry." His apology, which would have been the center of the drama just minutes before, was now nothing more than background noise. A real, life-altering drama was playing out right in front of him. Mr. Han seemed to understand that the path of logic and records had reached a dead end. There was only one path left. He delved deeper into his memory, pulling out the most precious, intangible thing he had left of his daughter. He began to hum. It was a simple, haunting melody. A lullaby. It was tender and sad. A tune that spoke of love and loss, and the quiet hope of a starry night. As the melody filled the air, Leora's carefully constructed world shattered. That song. She knew that song. It was a tune that had lived in the deepest recesses of her mind for her entire life. She had no idea where it came from. She would hum it to herself when she was sad, or couldn't sleep, a wordless, comforting refrain from a past she couldn't access. She had always assumed it was something she had made up, a piece of her own subconscious. But here was this stranger, this Korean chairman, this grieving father, humming her secret song. Tears began to stream down Leora's face, hot and silent. The coincidence of the birthmark was improbable. But the lullaby was impossible. It was a key turning in a lock she never knew existed, opening a door into a room that had been sealed for 30 years. The melody ended. Mr. Han was looking at her, his own face wet with tears. The hope in his eyes was now blazing fierce and overwhelming. He spoke the words of the lullaby, his voice thick with emotion. He began humming a Korean lullaby. "Sleep well, my baby. The stars and the moon will watch over you." Leora found her voice, and without thinking she finished the line, the Korean words flowing out of her, as if she had spoken them yesterday. "Sleep well, my baby. My good baby." A collective, soul-shattering sob escaped Mr. Han's lips. It was the sound of 3 decades of grief, of searching, of holding on to a dying ember of hope finally being released. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch her, but as if to assure himself she was real. "Mei Young." He whispered the name, a fragile prayer. Han Mei Young. Leora looked at the man who was her father. The waitress uniform felt like a costume, the restaurant a stage for a play she never knew she was a part of. She nodded, the single movement, feeling like the most significant act of her entire life. The tears were flowing freely now, a baptism washing away the old and welcoming a new, terrifying and wondrous truth. Yes, she whispered in English the word, feeling inadequate. And then she said it in the language of her birth, the name she had just reclaimed. "Yes. Dad." The dam broke. Mr. Han surged forward and wrapped his arms around her, holding his daughter for the first time in 30 years. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with sobs of profound relief and joy. Leora clung to him, this stranger, who was her flesh and blood, and wept for the lifetime they had lost and the future they had just miraculously found. The restaurant with its chandeliers and fine china bore silent witness. The patrons, the staff, Julian Croft, they were no longer just spectators. They were humbled witnesses to a miracle. The reunion at the entrance of Aurelia was a moment suspended in time, sacred and intensely private, yet performed on a public stage. The father and daughter clung to each other, their shared sobs the only sound in the cavernous room. Mr. Michael Kim stood beside them, his own face streaked with tears, his professional composure utterly dissolved in the face of this overwhelming miracle. He placed a gentle hand on his chairman's back, a gesture of support and shared joy. The patrons of Aurelia, who had earlier been a chorus of judgment, were now a congregation of the humbled. The Davenports at the front table looked on their faces, etched with a mixture of awe and deep, profound shame. Mrs. Davenport dabbed at her eyes with her silk napkin, not out of disgust, but to wipe away a tear of genuine emotion. The value of their jewelry, the status of their last names, The importance of their reservations, all of it had been rendered meaningless. They had come for a meal and were instead being served a lesson in humanity. Julian Croft felt as though the marble floor might swallow him whole. Every protocol he had followed, every rule he had enforced, had been a barrier to this beautiful, impossible moment. He had looked at Chairman John Hunn and seen a nuisance. He had looked at Leora Kennedy and seen an easily replaceable employee. He had been blind deaf and utterly wrong. The shame was a physical sensation, a hot flush that spread from his neck to his face. He had almost called security on a man who was searching for his lost child. He had almost fired the very woman who was that child. The thought was nauseating. Slowly, tenderly, Mr. Hunn pulled back, though he never let go of his daughter's arms. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. He studied her features, the eyes, the nose, the curve of her smile that was so much like her mother's, as if trying to commit every detail to memory, to bridge the 30-year gap with a single, loving gaze. He murmured to her in Korean soft words of love, of sorrow for the lost years of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. Leora or Mi Young could only listen, her heart overflowing. A lifetime of questions was being answered, not with documents or explanations, but with a father's touch, with the irrefutable truth of his presence. It was Chloe who broke the spell of silence. With a clarity and grace no one would have expected from her, she walked quietly to the maitre d' stand, picked up the reserved sign from the most secluded private table in the restaurant, a corner booth with a view of the rain-streaked city lights, and placed it on a nearby service tray. She then approached the small, tearful family. "Leora," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Hunn, please, come and sit down." Julian jolted into action, rushed forward. "Yes, of course. Please, Chairman, Miss Kennedy. Please be my guests. Anything you want. The entire restaurant is at your disposal." His voice was stripped of its arrogance, replaced by a desperate, pleading sincerity. Mr. Hunn looked at Julian, his eyes clear and discerning. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep, weary understanding of how the world worked. He gave a slight nod, a gesture of forgiveness that Julian in no way deserved, but desperately needed. Leora led her father to the booth. He sank into the plush leather seat, never taking his eyes off her, as if afraid she might vanish if he blinked. She sat opposite him, and Mr. Kim took a seat beside his chairman, a silent guardian. A different kind of energy now filled Aurelia. The staff who had been frozen in place moved with a new, quiet purpose. The head chef, a notoriously temperamental Frenchman named Jean-Pierre, emerged from the kitchen, his white uniform immaculate. He had been told by a frantic sous-chef what was happening. He walked to the table, bowed his head deeply to Mr. Hunn, and simply said, "Monsieur, it is an honor to have you in my restaurant. Please allow me to prepare something for you. Anything." But Mr. Hunn wasn't interested in the Michelin-starred cuisine. He looked at Leora and spoke in Korean, his voice gentle. Leora listened, then smiled through her tears. She turned to the expectant chef. "Thank you, Chef Jean-Pierre. That is very kind. But my father, he has a special request. It's not on the menu. Anything," the chef repeated, his curiosity piqued. "He would like a simple bowl of jjajangmyeon," Leora said. The chef looked confused. He was a master of French gastronomy. He had never heard of the dish, Leora explained. "It's a Korean noodle dish. Black bean sauce, some pork, some vegetables. It's comfort food." Mr. Hunn spoke again, his eyes on Leora. She translated her voice, soft. "It was the first solid food I ever ate. He fed it to me himself. It was the last meal we shared before he brought me to the orphanage. The simple request was laden with a lifetime of meaning. It was an attempt to reclaim a stolen memory, to connect the beginning to the present." Chef Jean-Pierre's professional pride vanished, replaced by a deep artistic empathy. A meal wasn't just food, it was a story. And this was the most important story he had ever been asked to tell. He had no idea how to make it, but he was one of the best chefs in the world. Secretary Kim the chef said, turning to Mr. Han's associate, "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to my kitchen and guiding my hand?" Mr. Kim, stunned by the request, looked to his chairman. Mr. Han nodded his approval. A flicker of excitement crossed Mr. Kim's face. To cook for the chairman on this night of all nights was an immense honor. He bowed and followed the chef into the gleaming steel kitchen, the two men from vastly different worlds, now united in a single sacred mission. While they were gone, father and daughter were left in the quiet intimacy of their booth. The other patrons had started to leave one by one, understanding that the family needed privacy. They left not with annoyed mutters, but with soft, respectful nods towards the corner table. Mr. Davenport paused by Julian's side on his way out. "Croft," he said, his voice low, "I've never been more ashamed of myself, or more moved in my entire life. You have a remarkable young woman on your staff." He placed a $500 bill on the maitre d' stand. "For her, not as a tip, as an apology." Julian could only nod his throat too tight to speak. In the booth, Mr. Han reached across the table and took Leora's hand. He held up the small, tarnished silver locket he had brought. With a click, he opened it. On one side was the faded photo of him and the baby. On the other, a tiny, empty space. "This half," he said in Korean, his voice thick with emotion, "was always meant for a picture of you when you grew up. I have waited 30 years to fill it." Leora looked at her father, this man whose love was so immense it had crossed oceans and decades to find her. The identity of Leora Kennedy, the struggling waitress, was slipping away, not to be erased, but to be integrated into a much larger, more profound identity, Han Mi-young, the found daughter. The journey of understanding who she was had only just begun, but for the first time in her life, she had a map. She had a beginning. The kitchen of Aurelia, normally a fortress of culinary ego, became a humble classroom. Chef Jean-Pierre, a man celebrated for his command of French cuisine, set aside his pride to learn from Mr. Kim. Together they worked to recreate a simple noodle dish, united by the understanding that they were not merely cooking food, but restoring a piece of a man's soul. In the quiet dining room, now empty of all other patrons, Mi-young and her father sat in their secluded booth, bridging the chasm of 30 years with words. She told him of her life as Leora Kennedy, a quiet, loving upbringing in Vermont, the loss of her adoptive parents, and her solitary struggles in the city. He in turn painted a portrait of a past she never knew. He spoke of her mother, an artist who loved the color yellow, and of his own desperate fight against poverty. He then revealed the full truth of his journey. The small electronics parts shop he started had grown into the global technology giant Solara Industries. Mi-young was stunned into silence. Her father was not just a successful businessman, he was Chairman John Horn, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Asia. The shabby coat and weary demeanor were not born of poverty, but of pilgrimage. He had returned to this place not as a titan of industry, but as the young, heartbroken father he had been hoping to reverse time itself. The immense weight of his love, a love that had fueled a 30-year search and built an empire, settled upon her. All his wealth was meaningless to him in that moment. She was the only treasure he had ever sought. Soon, Chef Jean-Pierre returned, carrying a single steaming bowl of jjajangmyeon with the reverence of a holy offering. He placed it between them and bowed. The rich, dark sauce over the noodles gleamed under the soft lights, its savory aroma a scent of profound comfort. Mr. Han picked up the chopsticks, his hand steady now. He lovingly mixed the sauce and noodles together before lifting the first bite and holding it out to her. "Miyanga," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eat." She leaned forward and accepted the offering. The flavor was a revelation, deep savory and heart-wrenchingly familiar. It tasted like a memory she never knew she had. It tasted of home. A single tear traced a path down her cheek as she looked at her father, a silent thank you for a meal 30 years in the making. As they shared the bowl, Julian Croft approached the table, his entire posture one of deep contrition. "Chairman Han, Miss Miyang," he began, his voice trembling. "There are no words to express my regret. My behavior was inexcusable. I will tender my resignation immediately." Miyang listened to her father's calm reply in Korean, then translated. "My father says he did not come here for apologies. He came to find his daughter." She looked at Julian, her gaze clear and steady. "He hopes you will remember this evening, and that the next time someone walks through your door, you will see their heart before you see their coat." Julian nodded, humbled and grateful, and retreated as a changed man. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the sky tinged with the soft grey of dawn. A new day was beginning. As they prepared to leave, Miyang untied the strings of her waitress apron, folded it neatly, and left it on the table, a final farewell to the life she was leaving behind. Her father gently draped his own worn coat over her shoulders. It was still damp, but it felt like the warmest, most protective embrace. Hand in hand, they walked to the door. Before stepping out, Mr. Han paused and looked back at the empty, magnificent room. 30 years ago, I left my heart in this place, he said to his daughter, his voice full of peace. Tonight, I am finally taking it home. Walking out of the gilded doors of Aurelia and into the pre-dawn quiet of the Boston street was like stepping from one reality into another. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating a glittering, dreamlike landscape. For Miyang, it felt as though she had been living her entire life in black and white, and someone had just turned the world to color. A sleek black Mercedes Maybach was parked at the curb, its engine purring silently. A chauffeur in a black suit stood holding an umbrella, though the rain had all but stopped. It was a stark contrast to the two men who had arrived on foot just hours before. This was the world of Chairman John Han. It was now impossibly her world, too. The chauffeur opened the door and her father guided her into the spacious, leather-scented interior. As he sat beside her, he never once let go of her hand. Mr. Kim took the passenger seat, speaking quietly into his phone in Korean, his voice a low, efficient murmur. He was already rearranging the world for them, postponing flights, cancelling meetings, and likely beginning the complex legal process of formally acknowledging her identity. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently through the empty streets. Miyang looked back at Aurelia, its warm lights glowing in the twilight. She saw Julian Croft standing in the doorway, watching them leave a solitary figure in the grand entrance. She felt a surprising pang of pity for him, not of anger. He was trapped in his world of judgment, while she had just been set free. "We are going to the hotel," her father said softly, in Korean, noticing her gaze. "You must be exhausted." Exhausted was an understatement. She felt as though she had lived an entire lifetime in the span of a few hours. But underneath the exhaustion was a thrumming, vibrant energy, a sense of profound, life-altering change. And after that, she asked the question encompassing everything, the future, her identity, their new reality. After that, he said, his grip on her hand tightening. "We are going home, to Seoul, if you will come with me." The question hung in the air, filled with a gentle, paternal anxiety. He had found her, but he knew he could not command her. He had to invite her into his life. Mi-young looked at her father's face, etched with worry and hope in the dim light of the car. She thought of her small, lonely apartment, her dead-end job, her life, that had felt like a long, quiet prelude to something that never arrived. She had spent years studying the history of art, the stories behind objects. Now she had the chance to study her own history, the story behind her own life. There was no question. "Yes, Dad," she said the word Dad, feeling more natural with each utterance. "I'll come home." A radiant smile transformed his face, erasing the years of sorrow. The chairman of Solara Industries vanished, replaced by a father whose greatest wish had just been granted. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. There were DNA tests, legal documents, and a quiet emotional press conference in Seoul, where Chairman Hon, with his daughter by his side, told the world his incredible story. The tale of the billionaire and the waitress became a global sensation, a modern-day fairy tale that captured the hearts of millions. But for Mi-young, the true magic happened away from the cameras. It happened in the quiet moments, walking with her father through the halls of a home, filled with pictures of a mother she would never know but could now learn about. It happened when he showed her the room he had kept for her untouched for 30 years, waiting for her return. It happened when he took her to a small, humble restaurant in a Seoul market, and they shared another bowl of jjajangmyeon, this time laughing through their tears. She learned about Solara Industries, not as a source of wealth, but as the engine of her father's search, the testament to his unwavering determination. She met his staff, who looked at her with a reverence and joy that mirrored his own. She never forgot Leora Kennedy. She was still a part of her, the girl who loved art history, who was kind to strangers, who had the courage to step forward in a silent room. Han Mi-young did not erase Leora Kennedy. She completed her. She enrolled in Seoul National University to study Korean art, connecting her old passion with her new heritage. Sometimes, late at night, in her beautiful room, overlooking the glittering expanse of Seoul, she would hum the lullaby her father had sung to her. The song was no longer a mystery. It was not a sad refrain of a forgotten past, but a beautiful, powerful anthem of a love that had refused to die, a love that had crossed oceans, weathered storms, and against all odds had finally found its way home. The story of Han Mi-young and her father is a powerful reminder that we never truly know the battles the people around us are fighting. The old man in the worn coat, the quiet waitress in the corner, everyone has a story, a history hidden just beneath the surface. It's a testament to a father's relentless love and a daughter's buried identity, a miracle born not from wealth or power, but from a single courageous act of empathy. It challenges us to look past the clothes, the job and the language barriers, and to see the shared humanity that connects us all. Sometimes the most extraordinary destinies are hidden in the most ordinary of places, waiting for just one person to be brave enough to listen. If this story moved you and reminded you of the power of compassion, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates profound, real-life stories. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell, so you won't miss our next story that uncovers the extraordinary in the ordinary. What part of this story resonated with you the most? Have you ever witnessed a moment where a simple act of kindness changed everything? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.